All right, this PowerPoint presentation is an introduction to the wet-on-wet non-objective painting. So I'm going to, as I walk you through it, I'm going to be moving back and forth from the PowerPoint to a separate image of some of these watercolor paintings so I can zoom in and show you some things. So I'm going to take this a bit beyond the assignment, but start off by introducing the assignment and then show you some applications of wet-on-wet. So I will go to the full screen now, and hopefully it will keep recording as I move on here. So there are two major characteristics of watercolor, I believe: transparency and spontaneity. Obviously, you can have transparency with oil or acrylic by just adding more of water or turpentine, and you can have spontaneity with both media. Nevertheless, those two characteristics are what watercolor is really known for. This particular assignment, the end product, a half-sheet watercolor painting, needs to be predominantly a wet-on-wet painting with no specific subject. It's not a painting of anything. It is non-objective or non-representational. You may end up with some hard-edged effects here and there, but they should not be the major theme of the painting. So you're going to cut or tear a 22 by 30 inch sheet of watercolor paper in half. So you're working with a 15 by 22 format, either vertical or horizontal, and it will be non-objective. This image, in my opinion, is the best example of the wet-on-wet non-objective assignment that a student has ever done in my class. It's lost a little bit of the effect because right down here, some paint has flaked or flecked off of the surface. And it's kind of an interesting little motif, but this was a really dark focal point. The reason it's fallen off of the surface is because Katie actually got the paint a little too thick in this area. She was painting with something that was a little cream consistency instead of the consistency of water, and over time it has started to crack and peel away. But that aside, I still want to share with you a detail of what she did here. I'm going to move out of the full frame here and pull the image down excuse me, to my screen and zoom in. One of the things that really worked out well on this are those little flecks of white that you can see, the little sparkle of color. It's got some great wet-on-wet areas. By the way, you can see better here now as kind of a seashell motif, but that's where the paint started peeling away. But this white sparkle of the paper that showed up throughout was actually an accident. The approach she used on this painting was to spritz the surface, and we'll close that for now. She spritzed the surface with a spray bottle, sprayed the surface with water instead of brushing it with water, and then she dropped the pigment into the wet surface that she had sprayed onto the paper. Excuse me. And when she sprayed the paper instead of brushing it, the spray did not settle into all of the little bumpy recessed areas. And so when she dropped the pigment in, as it spread out across the page, it avoided the dry areas. That's a little technique that you learn to use, that by pre-moistening an area of the paper, you can prevent the paint from traveling beyond where you moistened. It won't travel from a moist area to a dry area on its own. You have to brush it across. And so you can create little dams or dikes, little stops, by creating a hard or leaving a dry area of the paper. Anyway, that's how she got that effect. And it really is a very effective technique. Excuse me. So, Katie Owens, now Katie Powell, did this piece a number of years ago now. This Wet-on-Wet non-objective was done by Rachel Philbeck in 2009. Katie's, I believe, was 2 or 3 years before that. Wasn't really wild about the color scheme of this one, but it really is an effective wet-on-wet. There's nice visual flow, and it works vertically, horizontally. By the way, that's one thing you can try on this painting, is flipping it over, turning it 90 degrees or 180 degrees, and see how it works. This is an effective wet-on-wet. So in this context of wet-on-wet, I would be remiss if I did not introduce you or talk a little bit about Paul Jenkins, a world-renowned watercolorist and acrylic painter, famous for doing large theater sets, paintings that are 10 feet by 20 feet or even larger. But this is a watercolor painting, 14 by 22, so it's about a half sheet of paper. And it is wet on wet. Now it does end up with some hard edges, and that's a distinctive quality of Jenkins' work, is this intermixing of hard edge shapes and wet on wet areas where the watercolor is allowed to just blend and flow. If you turn in something similar to this, and I'm not suggesting that you copy a Paul Jenkins painting by any means, but this would be predominantly wet on wet. But be careful that the hard edges don't begin to dominate. Another Paul Jenkins wet on wet, this one, Veil Before, is the title of it. And again, this is approximately a half sheet painting. One more, Paul Jenkins, Phenomena, Pilgrim Thanks. By the way, I think all three of these, or prints of them, lithographic prints of them, were on sale out on the internet, and that's where I borrowed the images from. This is a nice example of wet on wet with very little hard edge quality. Even the edges that are a little more abrupt, if you look closely, it was all painted into a wet surface. So I want to talk to you a little bit about wet-on-wet realism, or using wet-on-wet technique in realism. And in doing this, I'm going to walk you through several paintings I've done over the years. This one goes back to the time when I was teaching high school art. Well, in fact, I did this painting about a year after I graduated from Harding. Always intrigued by texture, and in this case it was the texture of a cottonwood tree, that real rough bark. If you're from the Midwest, Kansas or Nebraska, you're very familiar with cottonwood trees. And the contrast between that underbark lower half and the outer bark top half is intriguing. There is a lot of linear work in this, line work, in the detail on the top half and the detail on the bottom half. But there's also a lot of wet on wet. The modeling, the creation of three-dimensional form is done almost exclusively by using this wet on wet technique. That's a full sheet painting, 22 by 30 inches. This painting I did about the time, actually it was right after I came to Harding to teach. I came here in 1978. I did this painting in 1979, but it is in fact a detail photograph, done from a detail photograph of the siding of the garage behind my house, a house I was renting. And I had taken this photograph and then decided to do a painting of that peeling paint. And again, the modeling, the three-dimensional modeling, is almost all done with this wet-on-wet to get the gradations of form. One of the interesting things I think about this painting, and another one I'll share with you in a little bit, is that it is what appears to be peeling off of the surface, the white paint, is in fact the one area of the paper that has no paint on it. The white you see is the white of the paper. And so there's kind of a contradiction here, or an optical illusion. What appears to be dimensional is in fact the paper itself. This painting I did in 1992. The image we have of it here is a little overexposed, so it's not the greatest photograph of the painting. If I sold this painting, my wife would never speak to me again. It's her favorite painting. It hangs in our kitchen eating area. It's a full sheet painting, and it was kind of a breakthrough painting for me because with it, I wasn't really happy with the leaves, the way I was handling the leaves. Well, before I go there, let me mention, there's a great deal of wet-on-wet. The entire background behind the rock and over to the right of the rock is all wet-on-wet, and the big boulder itself is a series of small wet-on-wet areas. So there's a tremendous amount of wet-on-wet happening in this painting. I believe you saw my low battery signal come up, so I had to pause and plug it in. So it would take quite a while to actually tell you how I walked my way through this painting, but what I did want to share with you is, and I'm going to have to get out of this full screen mode for just a second and come to this, because I wanted to zoom in to this lower left corner. I was really frustrated with my watercolor approach to the leaves tumbling over, cascading over the side of that boulder. By the way, that boulder is beside the old Pangburn Highway, a road that went, a dirt trail, a wagon trail that went from Pangburn, Arkansas down to Searcy, and I have a map showing it, a map from 1844 showing that road, and it cuts across the property I own, and it's about 30 feet wide in line with boulders like this. So these leaves over on the left, this cascade of leaves, are opaque watercolor, more like gouache, using Chinese white with color. And first time I used that particular, a Chinese white and opaque watercolor. And this is, again, 1992, and I had been painting with watercolor since 1979. And so quite a few years under my belt using transparent watercolor with no opaque watercolor. And that's why I not because I did it, but because the only way you're going to really learn to paint in watercolor is if you do paint with the transparent watercolor and using the white of the paper. And so some watercolorists would say I cheated on this. There are times when the opaque works, and it's the best way to solve a visual problem. That's the first time I ever used it. I do occasionally now. This painting I called Triad because there's actually a triadic color scheme, believe it or not, in there. Done in 2004 of a stark winter scene of the bright red-purple berries of what we call the beauty bush. painting has a lot more visual punch than my image of it here on the screen. But that aside, I shared this, I put this one in the PowerPoint because of the background. This is a contrast, as several of these paintings I'm showing you are a contrast between wet-on-wet and hard-edged realism. In this case, the background is very spontaneous, free-flowing wet-on-wet. I do want to point out the way I did this painting, though, because I did not follow the protocol that you would normally use to do a painting like this. It appears that I would have used a miscut or a mascoid of some sort and protected those long, heavy stems and the area the berries were going to go, and maybe that green briar cutting across also. Protected those with miscut, and then painted the background real quickly, wet on wet, and then taking the miscut off, go in and paint the detail. With this painting, I decided to try to do it with no miscut. So what I did, well, it's kind of a paint by number, if you will. I painted this space wet on wet. Then, well, you see I have a bunch of small areas, spaces, that are set apart by hard-edged shapes in the foreground. So I attacked those one at a time, and I painted this area. Actually, I moistened this all the way across to about in here, and then I painted this area, so the watercolor gradually tapered away into the water before it hit the dry paper, and I was able to work it from left to right and then from right to left. So having done that, and I don't remember which order I did it in, then I took this area and I painted it, making sure that the shadow here and the highlight here lined up and matched with this. Then I painted this area, one area at a time, making sure that my lines lined up to make it look like this was painted with one long stroke of wet on wet. These ouzels, or blooms, blossoms, as they are sometimes called, I like to call them ouzels, borrowed that term from Elliot O'Hara, a famous watercolorist. It's the term he used. Just water dropped into a wet surface, and then it dilutes the stronger watercolor paper, and you get these nice feathery blossoms or blooms. When I finished the wet-on-wet background and then painted in all the detail in the twigs and branches, I was really unhappy with it because it just felt empty. They had the background and then they had the foreground. Something wasn't working. So I went back in with a transparent glaze and painted what appeared to be distant trees or branches or twigs, these long vertical glazes. So this looks like I painted this glaze all the way across the page, but I in fact painted this one, then this, then this, then this, stopping, and so I didn't paint over. And so all of that background glazing, including this big swath here, had to be done this part, then these parts, to make it look like it was painted with one brush stroke. Technically, that was a difficult painting to pull off. I was pleased with how it came out. You can tell I painted little sections at a time because look at how they don't always match. This area doesn't match this area. This doesn't match this. Some areas, this one does not match this one. I rather liked that because it gave it a bit of a stained glass window feeling. So just a different approach, but the point here is there's a lot of wet on wet in that painting. Again, here's a lot of wet on wet, and in this case I really need to get out of my full screen mode and come up here and pull this down so you can look at it, because I want to zoom in and show you what I mean. Yes, it has these hard-edged areas that define, and you don't want those hard-edged areas. You want to avoid that in your painting. But this would have made a really nice wet-on-wet non-objective painting if I had done something like this on a larger scale. The deep blues and the rust colors, a complementary color scheme, works pretty well. Again, with this painting, it's kind of an optical illusion, because this paint that appears to be peeling off of what was a metal tank. By the way, that tank used to stand over where the theater building is on the southwest side of campus. It was removed, of course, when we built over there. But it was a metal tank with white paint, and the paint was peeling off and the metal was rusting. I actually was with watercolor students. We were out photographing that day, and I took several photographs of that and decided to do a full sheet watercolor painting. But again, a lot of wet-on-wet non-objective. This is wet-on-wet, or not objective, I'm sorry. This is wet-on-wet. This is wet-on-wet. Everything except these little cracks and crevices. Those were painted hard-edged to make it look like cracks and crevices, but most of the area that actually has paint on it was painted as a wet-on-wet. So back to the PowerPoint. That was in 2008, again a full sheet painting. I'm going to end this PowerPoint with this painting. This painting was done on hot press paper. I'm not real pleased with the color of the PowerPoint slide, but it'll still work. Again, I'm not that familiar. I've done a number of paintings now on hot press paper. I decided I wanted to do this one on hot press paper, and that was a big mistake, because I needed a really spontaneous area in each of these tomatoes. I needed them to be wet on wet, and I started with this tomato, and I started painting it, and that hot press paper was showing brush marks, and I wanted it to feel more like this one and this one, and it was just not working. So I stopped, let it dry, and I lifted the color off the tomato. I blotted, moistened, blotted, and moistened until there was nothing left but a bit of a stain on the tomato. Let the paper dry, and then I approached it the way I should have to begin with. This is a full sheet painting, 22 inches by 30 inches. And so each of these tomatoes is several inches across. They're bigger than life, because they were little small Roma tomatoes, appropriate Roma tomatoes in Scandicci. By the way, Scandicci is the suburb that is the closest part of Florence, to the Harding Villa. You go down to Scandicci to catch the bus or the tram to get down to the Duomo. My wife was buying some stuff from the local market there in Scandicci, and I was photographing the vegetables and fruit while she was trying to make sure the little Italian ladies didn't crowd in front of her, which they're really prone to do. Well, back to the tomatoes. Each one of these tomatoes took more than about 20 seconds to paint, 30 at the most, because that's all the time I had. So I would moisten the area, very quickly drop the paint in, and in some cases dropped water in. This was an area where I avoided painting this. I just let the watercolor run. This one I dropped some water back in to get a little lighter area. But I needed that spontaneity. Kind of blew it on this one. It looks worked. That's that hot press paper. You just can't keep brushing it. So all of the tomatoes, the bulk of the paper there, was painted within just a few minutes. Well, then I needed to do the green foliage. I had used Misket to protect it so I could paint the tomatoes very quickly. So when I took the Misket off and started painting these, that is very controlled paint. In fact, let's get out of this and pull a separate image up, and you can see what I'm talking about. There's just quite a bit of detail. It took a while to get these curls and twists of that tomato vine to really do what I wanted them to do. It's still wet on wet to get this rounded look here. It's wet on wet. So all the modeling of form is wet on wet. By the way, one of my titles for this painting is called the Missing Tomato, because there was one tomato that broke off the vine, and that's where it would have been. So you wouldn't really notice that, but there's the evidence of the missing tomato. I rather like that title. So a few minutes to paint the red, and probably a number of hours to paint all of the green. That's what happens when you get bogged down in detail. It's going to take a lot of time. Doesn't guarantee that you'll end up with a better painting, because the spontaneity of the wet on wet is what works best in that particular painting. Well, so let's go back up to the top here. As I said, this is about the wet on wet non-representational painting, but I wanted to share with you the application of wet on wet to realism. And you'll see it an awful lot in watercolor. And I'll do another short video PowerPoint that deals with hard-edged non-objective painting. So that's all for now.